Everyone expected the police to secure the crime scene and rush the injured child to emergency care, but instead the bedroom became a fortress no one could enter. Every officer in the doorway froze when the massive German Shepherd positioned himself across 8-year-old Mitchell Lewis's unconscious body and refused to let anyone approach the bed. At first, the responders thought he was overwhelmed, protecting an injured child with instinct gone haywire. But when the police dog locked his dark eyes on Detective Hale and emitted a low, warning growl, tension crackled through the room. Paramedics stepped back, hands raised. Officers exchanged worried glances. "Why is the dog targeting the lead detective?" someone whispered urgently. "And why does he keep circling back to the walls, scratching like he's trying to show us something hidden?" Shadow knew something everyone else didn't. He was warning them. But of what? No one in that pink-walled bedroom understood what was happening. The trained canine wouldn't allow the stepfather near the bed, blocking Richard Lewis with his full body weight each time the man tried to reach for his stepdaughter's hand. Medical equipment beeped steadily beside Mitchell's motionless form, but Shadow's growl grew deeper, more urgent, whenever certain people approached. Everyone thought this was just protective instinct gone wrong. And then he began moving with purpose, pacing frantically between the bed and the walls, pawing at specific spots, whining desperately at the closet door, staring at the lead detective with an intensity that made seasoned officers uncomfortable. He wasn't confused. He was investigating. He was accusing. Mitchell's stepfather stood frozen, his face pale. The detective shifted his weight, jaw tight. Officer Blake, Shadow's handler, whispered in disbelief, "He's never acted like this before. What is he sensing that we can't see?" Then came the question that changed everything, spoken by a young paramedic staring at the dog's deliberate movements. "Why is he acting like the real danger isn't the intruder who left, but someone still in this room?" But no one had any answer. The police dog was trying to tell them something. Something no one was prepared to believe. What happened next would expose a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the department itself. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The bedroom was drowning in wrongness. Not the obvious kind, but the subtle, creeping wrongness that makes your skin prickle and your instincts scream that something fundamental doesn't fit. 5 police officers crowded the doorway of Mitchell Lewis's childhood sanctuary, unable to cross the threshold, unable to reach the unconscious 8-year-old who desperately needed medical attention. All because 90 pounds of trained German Shepherd refused to grant them passage. The room itself told 2 competing stories. Soft pink walls decorated with hand-drawn crayon butterflies. A bookshelf overflowing with chapter books and stuffed animals. Photographs pinned to a corkboard showing a bright-eyed girl with golden brown hair laughing at birthday parties, hugging her late mother, holding a science fair ribbon. This was a space built for childhood joy, for safety, for dreams. But now it had transformed into something else entirely. Medical equipment lined one wall, hastily brought in by paramedics who couldn't get close enough to properly use it. Mitchell lay motionless in her bed, still wearing her purple pajamas, her small chest rising and falling in shallow, worrying rhythms. An oxygen monitor blinked red. Her skin was too pale, her breathing too shallow. Every second without proper medical intervention increased the danger. And between her and help stood Shadow. The massive German Shepherd lay across Mitchell's legs, his muscular body a living barrier. His dark, intelligent eyes tracked every movement in the doorway with laser focus. His ears swiveled at each sound, cataloging, analyzing. This wasn't the random protective instinct of a confused animal. This was deliberate, calculated, strategic. Officer Blake, Shadow's handler for 3 years, had never seen his partner like this. Shadow was a decorated canine with flawless service records. Obedient, disciplined, precise. He tracked suspects through forests, detected drugs in hidden compartments, protected officers during dangerous raids. He followed commands without hesitation. Until tonight. "Shadow, heel," Blake commanded, his voice firm but uncertain. The dog didn't move. His eyes remained locked on Detective Marcus Hale, who stood at the back of the group with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When Richard Lewis, Mitchell's stepfather, attempted to push past the officers, claiming his right to reach his daughter, Shadow's entire body went rigid. A growl rumbled from deep in his chest, low, threatening, unmistakable. Richard froze mid-step, his face draining of color. "The dog is traumatized from the scene," Detective Hale said smoothly, stepping forward with practiced authority. "We need to sedate him and get the girl proper medical attention. Officer Blake, control your animal." But when Hale moved toward the bed, Shadow's growl intensified into something primal. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth. The transformation was instant and absolute. This wasn't a pet. This was a predator, and he'd identified his target. Hale stopped, hands raised, trying to maintain his composure. See? He's clearly disturbed. We need. Shadow lunged forward 2 feet, stopping just short of Hale's legs, barking with such ferocity that the detective stumbled backward into the hallway. The other officers grabbed Hale's arms, pulling him to safety. The bedroom door slammed shut in the chaos. Through the door's window, Blake watched his partner return to Mitchell's bedside, circling her once before settling protectively across her body again. But Shadow wasn't done. He began pawing at the wall beside her bed, scratching with focused intensity at a specific spot near the nightstand. Then he moved to the closet, pressing his nose against the door frame, whining with desperate urgency. A chill ran down Blake's spine. Shadow wasn't protecting Mitchell from everyone. He was protecting her from specific people. And he was trying to show them something hidden, something everyone else had missed. In the hallway, Richard Lewis wiped sweat from his forehead, his hands trembling. I don't understand. I've never even met that dog before tonight. Why would he? You haven't? Blake interrupted, his mind racing. That wasn't true. Shadow had been at the Lewis home 3 weeks ago during a welfare check. The dog had searched every room, including Richard's home office. Blake had noted how thoroughly Shadow investigated the space, how he'd lingered near Mitchell, how the little girl had hugged him goodbye. Detective Hale's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then quickly pocketed it. We're wasting time. Get animal control here. Sedate the dog. Process the scene properly. But Blake wasn't listening anymore. He was watching Shadow through the window, watching how the dog kept returning to the same spots on the walls, how his eyes tracked specific people with targeted aggression, how he positioned himself not just as a protector but as a guardian against something specific, something personal, something human.
The reported home invasion didn't make sense. No forced entry. Nothing valuable stolen. Mitchell found unconscious with head trauma that paramedics quietly noted seemed inconsistent with a fall or struggle. And now Shadow, a dog who'd met Mitchell exactly once during a routine wellness check, refused to leave her side and seemed determined to keep certain people, including the lead detective and her own stepfather, as far from her as possible. Shadow wasn't confused. He wasn't traumatized. He wasn't acting on random protective instinct. He was conducting an investigation. And his findings were pointing toward a truth no one in that hallway wanted to acknowledge. That the real danger to Mitchell Lewis hadn't fled through a window into the night. It was still here. Still close. Still trusted. And the only one who could see it clearly was the dog who refused to leave her bedside. The tension in Mitchell's bedroom had stretched from hours into days, and Shadow's behavior only grew more disturbing with each passing moment. What officers initially dismissed as protective instinct had transformed into something far more calculated, more deliberate. The massive German Shepherd wasn't simply guarding an injured child, he was targeting specific people with laser-focused aggression that made even seasoned officers uncomfortable. Richard Lewis stood in the doorway, his face carefully arranged into an expression of fatherly concern. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped in what should have been the posture of a grieving stepfather. He took a tentative step toward Mitchell's bed, his hand outstretched as if to stroke her pale cheek. Shadow's response was immediate and terrifying. The dog's body went rigid, every muscle tensing beneath his thick coat. A low, rumbling growl emanated from deep in his chest. Not the confused whimper of a traumatized animal, but the deliberate warning of a predator who had identified a threat. His lips curled back, revealing teeth that gleamed white in the soft bedroom light. I just want to hold my daughter's hand, Richard said, his voice breaking convincingly. Please, she's all I have left. But Shadow didn't budge. He shifted his massive frame more directly over Mitchell's legs, positioning himself as an impenetrable barrier between the unconscious girl and her stepfather. His dark eyes never left Richard's face, tracking every micro-expression, every subtle movement. Blake stood near the window, watching the interaction with growing unease. His K-9 partner had worked dozens of cases, encountered countless suspects, navigated hundreds of tense situations. Shadow had never reacted this way to a victim's family member. Never. Sir, maybe we should give the dog some space, Blake suggested carefully, noting how Richard's jaw clenched at the suggestion, how his fingers curled into fists at his sides before he consciously relaxed them. The pattern repeated throughout the day. When Detective Hale entered for routine case updates, Shadow's ears flattened against a skull, his body going into a defensive crouch that Blake had only seen when the dog faced genuine danger. Hale would laugh it off, making jokes about Shadow being confused or stressed from the trauma of the scene, but his eyes betrayed something else, irritation, maybe even fear. Medical staff reported increasingly strange observations. Shadow seemed to be monitoring Mitchell's equipment with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. When nurses approached to check her vitals or adjust her for, the dog would watch carefully, allowing most to pass without incident. But when Nurse Carla appeared for the night shift, Shadow became agitated, whining anxiously, his nose twitching as if detecting something wrong in the air itself. "He won't let me near the medication cart," Carla complained to Blake, keeping a safe distance from the bed. "I need to administer her evening dose." Shadow positioned himself between the nurse and the four-pole, his gaze fixed on the syringe in her hand. His behavior wasn't random anxiety, it was purposeful, investigative, as if he were conducting his own assessment of everyone who entered the room. Blake crouched beside his partner, running his hand along Shadow's muscular back. The dog's fur was hot to the touch, his body practically vibrating with barely contained tension. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" Blake whispered. "What do you know that we don't?" Shadow turned his head briefly, meeting Blake's eyes with an intensity that sent chills down the officer's spine. Then the dog's attention snapped back to Richard, who had edged closer to the bed again, his movements slow and calculated. The realization hit Blake like a physical blow. Shadow wasn't confused. He wasn't traumatized. He was accusing. This highly trained canine had identified enemies in this room, a corrupt detective and a stepfather with something to hide. And Shadow was the only one brave enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to challenge them. 3 weeks ago, Shadow had been just another duty assignment, a routine school visit that Blake's K-9 unit ran several times each semester. The elementary school gymnasium had buzzed with the electric energy of 200 children barely containing their excitement as Blake demonstrated basic commands and explained how police dogs helped keep communities safe. Most kids had surged forward when given permission to approach, their hands outstretched, voices overlapping in a cacophony of questions. But one small figure had remained at the back of the crowd, dark braids hanging like curtains around a face that seemed older than 8 years should allow. Shadow had noticed her first. Despite the dozens of eager hands reaching for him, the shepherd had turned his head toward the quiet child, ears swiveling with purpose. When Blake finally worked his way through the throng, he found Shadow sitting perfectly still beside Mitchell, who had folded herself into a careful crouch. Her lips moved against the dog's fur, words too soft for Blake to hear, but Shadow listened with the focused intensity he usually reserved for tracking suspects. Blake had seen enough frightened children to recognize the signs, the way she flinched when voices rose, how her eyes constantly tracked the gymnasium exits, the careful space she maintained between herself and the other students. When he'd asked gently if everything was okay at home, her face had shuttered completely, fear replacing whatever fragile trust had begun to form. The wellness check request from the school counselor had come 2 days later. Ms. Peterson's email had been professionally worded but clearly concerned, increasing withdrawal, anxiety during parent pickup, reluctance to discuss home life. Standard protocol demanded follow-up. Richard Lewis had answered the door with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his handshake firm and his cooperation complete. The house had been immaculate, almost sterile in its perfection. Mitchell's room featured age-appropriate books arranged by height, toys displayed rather than played with, everything in its designated place. Shadow had moved through each room methodically, his nose working overtime. In Mitchell's bedroom, he'd paused by the closet, then at her desk. In Richard's home office, he'd spent long minutes near the filing cabinet, his body language speaking volumes Blake couldn't yet translate. The dog was cataloging something, creating a mental map of scents and spaces that his training told him mattered. When they'd left, Mitchell had wrapped her arms around Shadow's neck, her face buried in his fur. "I wish you could stay," she'd whispered, and Blake had felt that familiar helpless frustration of knowing something was wrong but having no proof, No cause, no legal grounds to intervene. Now Shadow had answered that whispered plea in the only way he could, by refusing to leave when every instinct screamed that this child needed protection. The 911 call had come in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night, Richard Lewis's voice cracking with what sounded like genuine panic. He'd returned home from a business dinner to find his daughter unconscious on her bedroom floor, the window gaping open to the November cold, her small body limp and unresponsive. He'd performed CPR. He'd begged the dispatcher to hurry. He'd sounded like every parent's worst nightmare given voice. Detective Marcus Hale had arrived on scene within 12 minutes, a response time that raised Blake's eyebrows when he'd first heard it. Hale was a decorated detective with 20 years on the force, the kind of rank that typically meant delegating residential break-ins to junior investigators. Yet he'd taken personal command immediately, his report filed and submitted before dawn with unusual efficiency. The narrative was clean, almost textbook, random home invasion, interrupted by the child's unexpected presence. Mitchell had fought back against the intruder, sustaining severe head trauma in the struggle. The perpetrator had fled through the bedroom window. Case classified as aggravated burglary with assault. Investigation ongoing. Blake had requested the scene photos that afternoon, using his involvement with Shadow as justification. What he found made his jaw tighten with each image he swiped through. The window showed no damage to the lock mechanism, no scratches, no pry marks, nothing suggesting forced entry. Inside Mitchell's room, a laptop sat undisturbed on her desk, its expensive case gleaming in the camera flash. In the master bedroom visible through the open doorway, jewelry spilled artfully from a box on the dresser, but nothing appeared missing. The signs of struggle looked like stage dressing from a community theater production. A lamp on its side, its shade slightly crumpled. Books scattered near the bookshelf in a pattern too neat to suggest violence. A chair positioned away from the desk at an angle that seemed deliberate rather than chaotic. Most troubling was the notation buried in Hale's report. Detective secured scene solo for 43 minutes prior to CSI arrival to preserve sensitive evidence and maintain chain of custody. Daniels had pulled Blake aside during the afternoon shift change, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the locker room. "You know Hale and Richard Lewis served together, right? Military intelligence, overseas deployment, the whole 9 yards." He'd paused, making sure no one else was listening. "And word is Richard just finalized his late wife's estate last month. Everything goes to Mitchell when she turns 18, we're talking substantial holdings, investments, property. But if something happens to her before then, it all reverts to dear old Dad as sole beneficiary." Blake had felt something cold settle in his stomach. How long ago did the wife die? 18 months. Car accident. Single vehicle collision on a clear day. Danielle's expression said everything his words didn't. Hale handled that investigation too. Shadow's behavior at the hospital wasn't subsiding. If anything, it intensified each time Blake tried to redirect him. The shepherd would return to Mitchell's bedside for minutes at a time, then resume his methodical inspection of the room's perimeter. But his focus kept returning to specific points on the walls with a precision that finally made Blake stop trying to correct him. The dog wasn't being destructive. He was being deliberate. Shadow scratched at the air vent near the ceiling with controlled intensity, then moved to paw at the corner of a generic landscape painting bolted to the wall. His nose worked overtime at each location, snuffling and huffing in a pattern Blake had seen him use when detecting traces of explosives or drugs. Blake pulled a chair over and examined the vent closely. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Standard hospital infrastructure, painted the same institutional beige as everything else. Then he noticed it, a shadow within a shadow, a tiny irregularity in the vent slats that didn't quite match the others. His stomach dropped. The pinhole camera was smaller than a shirt button, its lens barely visible even when he knew where to look. Professional-grade equipment, wireless capability, the kind of surveillance gear that cost serious money and required technical knowledge to install and operate. Behind the picture frame, he found another. This one angled to capture the bed from a different perspective, ensuring no blind spots. Blake's hands shook slightly as he called Captain Rodriguez directly, bypassing normal channels. Within 2 hours, a tech specialist from the cybercrimes unit had swept the room and extracted both devices. The analysis came back before midnight. The cameras had been active for at least 3 weeks. Time-stamped footage showing Mitchell doing homework at her desk, changing clothes in what she believed was privacy, sleeping in her bed while someone watched from behind the digital eye. The feed had been accessed remotely from 2 distinct IP addresses. One traced back to Richard Lewis's desktop computer at his financial consulting firm, the other to an encrypted burner phone that pinged off cell towers throughout the greater metro area. Every moment of Mitchell's private life had been catalogued, recorded, observed. Every conversation she'd had in her bedroom. Every tear she'd cried into her pillow. Every time she'd changed clothes or prepared for bed. Shadow had detected what no human investigator would have found. The faint electronic signatures, the foreign chemical scents of plastic and circuitry that didn't belong in a child's bedroom, the wrongness that his training and instincts screamed needed investigation. The random break-in narrative collapsed completely under the weight of this evidence. Someone had been watching Mitchell for weeks, learning her routines, studying her vulnerabilities, planning something that required this level of surveillance and preparation. Blake knelt beside Shadow, running his hand along the shepherd's neck. "Good boy," he whispered. "You knew. You knew all along." Blake returned to the Lewis house the following afternoon with official authorization to collect Mitchell's personal items. Clothes, her favorite stuffed animal, anything that might provide comfort when she woke up. If she woke up. The doctors still weren't making promises. Shadow rode beside him in the patrol vehicle, but the moment Blake opened the rear door, the dog ignored the house completely. His nose went to the ground, body tensing with purpose, and he pulled toward the detached garage with enough force that Blake had to jog to keep pace. "Shadow, heel." The command went unacknowledged. Shadow had found a scent, and nothing else mattered. The garage was climate-controlled and organized with the same sterile precision as the rest of Richard's property. Tools hung on pegboards in size order, plastic storage bins labeled in neat block letters, not a speck of oil or grease marring the concrete floor. Shadow bypassed all of it, making a direct line to a red metal toolbox mounted on the back wall. He dug at the base with both paws, whining with an urgency that made Blake's pulse quicken. The toolbox appeared standard issue, nothing remarkable. Blake pulled it down and examined it carefully. The weight seemed wrong, too light for the size. The false bottom released with a metallic click that sounded deafening in the quiet garage. Inside, wrapped in a plastic Ziploc bag like evidence waiting to be discovered, sat a prepaid burner phone. Blake's hands were steady as he powered it on, years of training overriding the adrenaline screaming through his system. The message history loaded slowly, each line of text another nail in a coffin that was rapidly sealing shut. The contacts were labeled simply R and M. M. She's becoming a liability. R. I know. Yesterday she asked about her mother's insurance policy. M. The estate closes in 6 weeks. After that, everything's locked in trust until she's 18. R. Can't wait that long. She's talking to her teacher, asking questions about trust funds and guardianship. M. We discussed this. Are you committed? R. The kid saw the financial records. She's asking her teacher questions about trust funds. M. We move Friday night. Make it look random. I'll handle the scene. R. What about forensics? M. I said I'll handle it. You just make sure you're at that dinner until 11:30. Alibi needs to be airtight. Friday. The night Mitchell had been found unconscious, her skull fractured, her life hanging by threads. Blake photographed every message, every timestamp, every character of damning evidence. Then he carefully powered down the phone, replaced it exactly as he'd found it, and reconstructed the false bottom with meticulous precision. They couldn't let Richard know the phone had been discovered. Not yet. Hale had access to every piece of official evidence, every report filed, every piece of physical proof collected. He could make things disappear with a few keystrokes and his 20 years of institutional trust. Shadow sat at attention beside Blake, watching with dark intelligent eyes as if asking, "What now?" "More," Blake whispered. "We need more." Shadow's hostility toward Nurse Carla began on her third shift rotation. Blake had initially dismissed it as stress. The shepherd had been living in a hospital for days, surviving on irregular sleep and the protein bars Blake smuggled past the front desk. But Shadow was a trained professional, and his aggression was specific, targeted, unmistakable. When Carla approached Mitchell's four-line with her medication tray, Shadow's lips peeled back from his teeth. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, the kind of warning he gave suspects reaching for weapons. He positioned his body as a physical barrier between the nurse and the equipment, refusing to budge even when Carla tried coaxing him with her gentlest voice. "Officer Blake, I really need to administer her medication." Carla's tone remained professional, but something flickered in her eyes. Irritation, maybe, or calculation. "She's due for her anti-inflammatory and the neurological support compound." Shadow's growl intensified. When Carla reached around him anyway, trying to access the foreport from a different angle, the shepherd snapped. His teeth didn't make contact, but the intent was clear enough that Carla stumbled backward, nearly dropping her tray. Hospital security arrived within minutes. Blake held up a hand before they could intervene. "Give me 24 hours, he said quietly. "Don't let her near this patient until I clear it." Daniels had the background check completed by midnight. Carla Jensen, RN, 15 years of spotless service at 3 different hospitals. Nothing in her record suggested corruption or criminal activity. But her bank statements told a different story. 3 deposits of $5,000 each over the past 2 weeks, all from a wire transfer service that specialized in anonymous transactions. The amounts matched withdrawals from an account Blake had discovered buried in Richard Lewis's financial records, an offshore holding that shouldn't have existed, that wasn't reported on any official documentation. Hospital administration brought in their head pharmacist and security chief. The testing was conducted with discretion that bordered on paranoia, samples drawn from Mitchell's 4-bag while Carla was on break. The results came back at 3 a.m., and Blake watched the color drain from the pharmacist's face as she read the lab report. "Thallium sulfate," she whispered. "Low dose, administered consistently over multiple days. It's designed to cause gradual multi-organ failure, heart, kidneys, liver. The symptoms would look like complications from her head trauma. We'd never have suspected poisoning." The antidote was administered immediately, Mitchell's 4 system flushed and replaced entirely. Carla was detained by hospital security as she arrived for her next shift, police taking her into custody before she could reach the pediatric ward. Blake sat beside Mitchell's bed as dawn broke through the window blinds, one hand resting on Shadow's neck. The doctors had been blunt. Another 48 hours at the dosage Carla had been administering, and Mitchell's organs would have begun catastrophic failure. Her death would have been signed off as tragic but unsurprising. Severe head trauma often led to complications, infection, secondary injuries. Shadow had detected the chemical alteration in the medication, the scent of poison that human noses couldn't begin to perceive. He'd prevented full-dose administration through sheer stubborn aggression, buying time for the investigation that exposed the plot. "You saved her life," Blake murmured. "Twice now." Shadow's tail thumped once against the linoleum, but his eyes never left Mitchell's face. The financial records sprawled across Danielle's desk like a map of greed and calculation. Blake had been staring at spreadsheets for 6 hours, his eyes burning, coffee going cold in its 3rd refill. But the picture emerging from the numbers was crystal clear, and it made his stomach turn. Catherine Lewis had died 8 months ago after a 2-year battle with ovarian cancer, leaving behind a daughter she'd tried desperately to protect even from beyond the grave. Her estate, $2.3 million in life insurance, property holdings, investment portfolios, and liquid assets, had been placed in an irrevocable trust with Mitchell as the sole beneficiary. The legal structure was airtight, designed by attorneys who understood exactly what they were guarding against. Richard Lewis was named temporary guardian, but the restrictions were suffocating for someone with his apparent appetites. He could access funds only for Mitchell's direct care, education, and documented medical needs. Every expenditure over $500 required receipts and justification. Annual accounting to the court was mandatory. The principal would transfer to Mitchell on her 18th birthday, with Richard receiving only a modest $2,000 monthly guardian stipend until then. For someone who'd married into money and grown accustomed to a certain lifestyle, it must have felt like prison. The embezzlement had started small, inflated tutoring invoices, medical equipment purchases that existed only on paper. But Richard had grown bolder, creating shell companies that billed the trust for services never rendered. Forged documents authorized transfers to educational investment accounts that funneled directly into his personal holdings. Over 8 months, he'd siphoned $800,000, leaving digital footprints he believed were covered but that a forensic accountant could follow like breadcrumbs. Mitchell had found the evidence by accident. The school counselor's notes, subpoenaed that morning, documented a conversation from 4 weeks prior. Mitchell had been doing homework in Richard's home office when she'd noticed papers left open on his desk, spreadsheets comparing rail account balances with the falsified statements he filed with the court-appointed trust monitor. She told me she was worried about the wrong math in Daddy Richard's papers, the counselor had written in careful script. Said the numbers didn't match what he told the judge people. She's a bright child, very good with patterns. She wanted to tell someone who could help but was afraid he'd be angry with her for looking at his private papers. The counselor had contacted Blake's unit the next day, requesting a welfare check. Standard protocol for a child showing signs of fear in the home. But Richard had been watching through the cameras he'd installed 3 weeks earlier. He'd heard every word Mitchell whispered in her bedroom, including her practice conversations about what she'd tell the police if they asked about the papers. He'd monitored her growing anxiety, her tentative plans to show the evidence to her teacher. The math was brutal in its simplicity. Once authorities investigated Mitchell's claims, Richard's embezzlement would be exposed within days. Criminal charges would follow: fraud, theft, exploitation of a minor. Prison time measured in years, not months. And complete, permanent loss of access to the remaining $1.5 million. Unless the witness disappeared. Unless a random tragedy struck, leaving Richard as the grieving stepfather with no oversight, no restrictions, and full control of an estate that would console him through his terrible loss. Shadow's nose had been working the contaminated 4 equipment for 20 minutes, cataloging scents with the methodical precision of a trained investigator. When hospital security finally cleared Blake to remove the evidence bag containing the poisoned medication supplies, the shepherd tracked the chemical signature through the parking garage with unwavering focus. He stopped at Detective Hale's personal vehicle, a silver Dodge Charger parked in a spot reserved for law enforcement. His alert was unmistakable, the same posture he used when detecting narcotics or explosives. Blake photographed the vehicle from every angle before calling Daniels. Shadow's got something. Hale's been here, had contact with the poisoned equipment. The scent trail didn't end at the parking garage. Shadow tracked it through city streets, pulling Blake and Daniels in an unmarked vehicle for 15 miles to a storage facility on the industrial outskirts of town. Unit 247, rented under the name Marcus Henderson, close enough to Hale's real name to be lazy, different enough to avoid casual detection. The credit card records took 3 hours to trace, but they led directly back to Hale's personal account. The warrant was signed by a judge who'd known Blake for 15 years and trusted his instincts. The storage unit door rolled up with a metallic screech that seemed too loud in the afternoon quiet. Inside, carefully organized on industrial shelving, sat the anatomy of conspiracy and attempted murder. Blake's flashlight swept across each piece, a professional glass cutter with fingerprint powder residue still visible on the handle, the prints matching Richard Lewis's records. A tactical baton, the kind carried by military personnel and private security, with dried blood and hair samples matted near the striking surface. Latex gloves in a size that matched Hale's medical records. Disposable shoe covers, still creased from their packaging. On the bottom shelf, a jewelry box Blake recognized from the crime scene photos, Catherine Lewis's personal collection, reported stolen during the break-in, but actually items Richard had planned to liquidate for cash once the heat died down. But the documents were what made the case unshakable. Forged estate papers showing Richard's falsified accounting, side by side with his real financial records proving systematic embezzlement. And most damning, a handwritten timeline on yellow legal pad paper, the writing unmistakably Hale's distinctive block print. 10:45 p.m., R confirms departure from dinner location. 11:15 p.m., entry through bedroom window, glass cutter, minimal sound. 11:20 p.m., subject neutralized, single strike, temporal region. 11:25 p.m., stage struggle, lamp, books, chair. 11:30 p.m., exit, secure weapon. 11:47 p.m., R discovers scene, calls 911. 12:03 a.m., arrive on scene, secure evidence before CSI. Blake was photographing the timeline when he heard the storage facility gate open. Hale's charger pulled up 30 seconds later, the detective climbing out with his phone in hand. Got an anonymous tip about this unit, Hale said, his voice already carrying the edge of someone who knew the game was over. His eyes swept the open storage unit, the evidence laid bare, Blake's camera still in hand. The color drained from his face in stages. Daniels stepped from behind the adjacent unit, badge already out. Marcus Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and corruption of office. The interrogation took 4 hours, but Hale broke within the first 90 minutes. Richard had approached him 6 months ago, desperate and drowning in the evidence of his embezzlement. They'd served together overseas, shared the kind of trust that came from combat and classified operations. Richard Lewis entered Mitchell's hospital room at 2:17 a.m., his stepfather privileges granting him access past the night guard with nothing more than a manufactured story about wanting private time to say goodbye to his dying daughter. His voice had cracked with practiced emotion, his eyes red-rimmed from what looked like genuine grief. The guard had stepped away, giving him the moment he requested. Richard approached the bed with measured steps, his hand reaching toward the ventilator controls, the life support systems that had sustained Mitchell through 5 days of unconsciousness. In his mind, the narrative was already written, the heartbroken stepfather making the impossible decision to let her go peacefully, given her lack of recovery progress. A tragedy, a mercy, an end to suffering. He didn't see Shadow until 90 pounds of protective fury launched from the shadows. The German Shepherd hit Richard with the full force of a trained attack dog, driving him away from the medical equipment, slamming him against the wall hard enough to crack the drywall. Shadow's teeth found purchase at Richard's throat, not breaking skin, but promising violence with every ounce of restrained power in his jaw. Richard's screams tore through the pediatric ward. Blake reached the room within seconds, Daniels right behind him, hospital security flooding the hallway. Blake's command pulled Shadow back just enough to allow Daniels to wrench Richard's arms behind his back, cuffs clicking into place while the man sobbed and screamed. She ruined everything. She was supposed to just keep quiet. This is her fault. All of this is her fault. The body cameras captured every word, every confession spilling from Richard's mouth as he collapsed against the wall, his carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. Within hours of Richard's arrest, as the antidote reached full effectiveness in Mitchell's system and the poison's grip finally released, something shifted. The monitors began registering stronger vital signs. Her fingers twitched against the sheets. Her eyelids fluttered with the first signs of consciousness. The medical staff who'd privately feared she might never wake watched in stunned silence as the 8-year-old girl's eyes opened, unfocused and confused but undeniably alive. Her gaze wandered the room, searching, until it landed on the massive German Shepherd sitting at perfect attention beside her bed. "You stayed." The words were barely a whisper, her throat raw from days of intubation. She reached a trembling hand toward Shadow, and he pressed his nose gently into her palm, his tail beginning a slow, measured wag. Blake stood in the corner, tears streaming down his face as he watched Mitchell's fingers weakly stroke Shadow's fur. "Thank you for not leaving me," she whispered. The charges came swift and comprehensive. Richard Lewis and Marcus Hale faced attempted murder, conspiracy, embezzlement, evidence tampering, corruption, and child endangerment. Nurse Carla was charged as an accessory to attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming, the confessions recorded, the conspiracy exposed in granular detail. Shadow received official commendation and was assigned as Mitchell's personal protection throughout her recovery and the trial proceedings. Mitchell was placed with her maternal Aunt Sarah, the guardian Catherine had originally wanted before Richard had convinced her otherwise with promises of stability and financial expertise. 2 months later, on a bright Saturday afternoon in a sunlit park, Mitchell stood with her arms wrapped around Shadow's neck, her laughter carrying on the breeze as they played fetch with a tennis ball worn soft from use. She was no longer the frightened, guarded child who'd whispered secrets into fur at a school gymnasium. The shadows had lifted from her eyes. Blake watched his partner finally rest, Shadow's head in Mitchell's lap, the dog's eyes half closed in contentment. Mission accomplished. Shadow had proven what Blake had always known but couldn't articulate until now. The most loyal protector isn't always the one bound by blood or law. Sometimes it's the one who sees clearly through deception, loves purely without agenda, and refuses to abandon their post even when logic suggests otherwise. The dog who wouldn't leave the bedroom had saved a life, delivered justice, and exposed evil hiding behind badges and family ties. He'd given voice to a child who had none, and refused to let darkness win. Sometimes the greatest guardian is the one who simply stays.